Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning, Hind, and all the rest of you. We are looking at the objections to this idea that hemispherectomies and the WADA test suggest that parts of the brain are independently conscious, right? So last time, here are the objections. Last time we looked at the first two. Uh, Maybe we embrace dualism, and we think that okay, there's just one mind, and it's like a immaterial entity that interacts with the hemispheres. But when one hemisphere is gone or anesthetized, it can't interact with them. So that on that view, there's just one mind, not many. And in the second case, the idea is that the mind that survives the procedure, again, whether it's hemispherectomy or a WADA test, is some midbrain structure. And so then you could just have one thing that is in causal interaction with the cortex, but it changes when one of the hemispheres is either shut down or missing. Uh, and this is not simply to say that the midbrain structures are necessary for consciousness. A lot of us agree on that. It's to say that that's where consciousness is, and it's not in the cortex at all. So the cortex is no more conscious than perhaps your digestive system in that view. And uh, we saw some responses to these, right? So to quickly run through it, right? Interactionism, I think, is a totally coherent picture. Uh, in fact, we have a kind of interactionism when we use Wi-Fi or any remote control or any kind of radio signals. The electromagnetic field allows us to do this, uh, and it's testable, right? Um, but we don't, to the extent that we've been able to test it, we don't seem to have good evidence for it in the medical or the scientific literature. So we know what good evidence would be because we have the electromagnetic field, and so we know what remote control looks like. So you can imagine going back in time and telling people about the electromagnetic field, and you can imagine them being skeptical and saying, why should I believe in that? And then you show them remote control or Wi-Fi or radio, uh, and they would quickly be they would be scientifically responsible if they quickly updated their beliefs and changed their mind and said, lo and behold, right, there's such a thing as this mysterious electromagnetic field. And the same would go for the brain. If you could show that the brain is being causally controlled by something immaterial and not local, and especially if it's being controlled in intelligent ways, it's making intelligent it's behaving intelligently on the basis of these apparent signals, you have very good reason to embrace some kind of dualism, some kind of interactionist dualism. Grace asks, do you mind reiterating what these objections are to? The idea that the brain and the soul transmit signals between each other. This is these are objections to my view that there's not just one conscious self in the cranium, that regions of the brain are independently conscious. And so just to quickly rehearse that, um, we normally have two hemispheres, but we know that there can be experiences of losing contact with a hemisphere. So in the WADA test, there is a patient whose left hemisphere is anesthetized, and the patient thinks, or there's the experience, I have no words. Oh my God, this is amazing. I have no words. And I'm arguing that that's being experienced by the right hemisphere, perhaps some midbrain structures, the surviving part of the brain that's not anesthetized. And okay, so a lot of people are willing to go to that step. But the next step that is more controversial is that because it remembers having had words and notices a difference, a change over time, it must have been conscious previously. So, so that means that you have your conscious cortex, but you also have your conscious right hemisphere, and you also have your conscious left hemisphere. And if we take the case of Jill Bolte Taylor seriously, then you probably also have a conscious region that survives a stroke like the kind that she survived, and perhaps many, many others, which I admit is a weird thing to think. And you're welcome. And so these are objections to that. These are ways you can try to hang on to this single mind thesis and say, no, no, there's just one mind. And so one way you do it uh, is is you say, now the mind is not the hemisphere. The mind is some immaterial thing that interacts with the hemispheres. Another way you do it is you say, no, the hemispheres themselves aren't conscious. It's something subcortical in the midbrain. Yeah. Okay. And so uh, so I do think that the dualism, interactionist dualism, is a totally coherent view that not only that, it's a scientific hypothesis. Just as it would be scientific to hypothesize that this gadget roaming around on Mars is in causal interaction with something immaterial, which it is, the electromagnetic field. Uh, and so I don't think it's a lot of people dismiss dualism as some kind of, figment of religious commitments, um, something that's not scientific. Um, but it's clearly a testable scientific hypothesis. Uh, and then we saw that in the second case, the second objection is kind of like taking the first objection and replacing immaterial minds with some subcortical part of the brain, like the thalamus or something. Uh, and I'm willing to admit that maybe that's the case. And there are people who do think that consciousness is centered in maybe the thalamus or some other midbrain structure. Um, uh, I think there are more people taking this seriously today than there were 10 years ago and certainly 20 years ago. But I still think it's a radical departure from our current understanding of the brain. Most people think that because it requires that you say that the hemispheres are not at all conscious. And that's what I think few people believe in neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience. And also, even if that's the case, then you can run the same thought experiment on the thalamus and ask, well, what happened if you lost half a thalamus? Now, to my knowledge, that there isn't like a split thalamus phenomenon. There aren't surgeons cutting the thalamus in half, or anesthetizing half the thalamus at a time. But there are patients with degraded thalamuses, and maybe you say thalami, and they some of them show very few signs of consciousness, and some of them are remarkably obviously conscious. Okay. Uh, okay. So that's just all in by way of review. Uh, we're now looking at this idea that the surviving this last way of trying to hang on to the single mind thesis and say there's just one. And in that case, when there's a WADA test, the left hemisphere goes to sleep, and so the mind kind of contracts, right? And and then it's this very same thing, but it's somehow realized only by the right hemisphere instead of both hemispheres. And it's thinking, oh my God, I have no words. This is amazing, right? And so this is Peter Godfrey Smith in the book Metazoa, um, responding to my argument. And he concludes that the half that is now conscious, that is not anesthetized, that half is now conscious, but it was not conscious. It was not a conscious system in itself beforehand, not a conscious system in itself beforehand. And my reply is twofold. So the first thing I do is ask, well, if it wasn't conscious beforehand, then it didn't know it had words. It wasn't, there was nothing it was like to be that hemisphere interacting with the other hemisphere and having words, being able to produce expressions of what it's thinking and so on, which makes it seem that in the moment that it's now conscious, according to Peter Godfrey Smith, its memories are false, strictly false, because it's suddenly conscious, but it has all these apparent memories of what it was like previously, because now it has no words, but it's thinking I used to have words, right? Uh, so that's one problem. And I use this image from the science fiction movie Blade Runner, uh, just to uh, represent that, because in that movie, these characters have their memories created for them. They have false memories. So that's the first reply. The second reply, uh, I think, is more challenging because it it brings up what are called fission problems. So you might have taken in like an intro to philosophy course or some other philosophy course, you might have been exposed to fission problems. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Like fission problems that have to do with personal identity in philosophy? I'm gonna pause and wait to see if anyone answers. Okay, so uh, some philosophers are interested in personal identity. What makes you you? And in virtue of what do you seemingly survive over time? So, yesterday you were different than you are today. You've lost a bunch of skin cells and other cells, including brain cells. The contents of your stomach were different. Blah blah. You've aged. Your fingernails have grown imperceptibly, but they have, right? So you're physically different. But we all want to say you're still you. And when you go get a haircut, you got the haircut, meaning you survived the haircut. Um, and I'm sure you're all somewhat familiar with Star Trek. This science fiction series goes way back to I guess the late 60s. And in that they beam around. So they can this machine, this transporter, can take them apart down I think to the atoms or maybe even subatomic particles, take them apart, and then send those atoms across space, like from a spaceship down to a planet, and then reassemble them. And supposedly it's the same exact person, right? And philosophers have these thought experiments. So, what if instead of using the actual atoms that that originally composed you, they just use some other atoms and assemble those in exactly the same way, so that your brain is in exactly the same state, so you have exactly the same memories and dispositions and thoughts, etc. What if, right? And at this point, our intuition seemed to just break down. Like, is that you or not? And by the way, the Star Trek, the show, seemingly has different explanations for exactly how this works as you go through the all the different uh, variations, all the different series and branching, different whatever next generation and all that. Um, so let's just assume that your originally it's your atoms that are sent and reassembled. But then for some reason, maybe something interferes in that process, and so they use some other atoms that they have on hand, uh, and they assemble you. And then there's this question: well, what happens if those streams get split? What happens if, for some reason or other, they create two assemblies of atoms that are identical to your assembly when you stepped on the platform in the first place? And so, which one's you, right? And this, I know, eventually did get used in one of the Star Trek. I think it was Next Generation, where this character gets uh, the stream gets split. So two versions of this person are made, and one ends up on the spaceship, and they go happily, merrily on their way, and the other one's stuck on the planet, wondering when he's going to get beamed up, and he's not very happy about it. Uh, Okay, so that's a thought experiment or a series of thought experiments that asks questions like, how do we identify the original, who the person is? Who are you, right? Well, now we have a similar question only it's closer to the real world because it doesn't require beaming up or teletransporting or anything like that. We have an objection, Peter Godfrey Smith's objection, and the view, the most common objection, and the view that I used to hold. I'm calling it objection three, and it's the idea that the surviving mind that was once associated with the whole brain is now associated with the remaining hemisphere. So in this case, if you lose the right hemisphere or if it goes to sleep, then the mind goes to the left hemisphere. Right? That's what Peter Godfrey Smith says. That's what I used to think. But I was convinced that this isn't going to work, or at least that it raises a lot of very challenging questions. And on further thought, it's, I would argue, at least more counterintuitive than the view that you just always have conscious regions in your brain in addition to the whole brain. You have proper regions that are independently conscious. On this proposal, no plurality of mind follows because you just have one hemisphere going to wherever the surviving part is. But I think it introduces uh, uh, other challenges. So, what happens in the case where the halves are detached but both are functioning? So this is a fission case, right? So imagine that they're detached, but both are functioning. We have only, logic leaves only four possibilities. So either this mind, this single mind, according to Peter Godfrey Smith, either it goes left like it did earlier, or it goes right, or it somehow goes to both, or it somehow goes to neither. If you think the mind just disappears, then that counts as going to neither. Uh, okay. Now, the first two, if it goes to the left or to the right, then the question is why, and why not the other? And uh, uh, both halves are cognitive. Only one usually can generate language, but it's hard to find someone who actually argues that one hemisphere is just not conscious. Period. Yes, Gazzaniga thought this in the 80s, but he seems to have changed that view. So what would disqualify? Like if you have a cognitive, you have two halves. They're both cognitive. You can talk to them. They can point to things. They can grab things. And one of them can speak English or whatever language. And so why would you? On what basis would you say that the mind only resides in one hemisphere? I just don't see any reason for that. So we're left with two other options. The third option is that the whole mind somehow goes to both. And I don't see how we can make sense of this because the two hemispheres are no longer interacting neurally and they're physically and functionally distinct. So we just saw all the experiments of the split brain patient. You can imagine what it's like to be the left hemisphere, seeing only the right half of the visual field, controlling only the right half of the body, et cetera, right? And you can imagine what that's like and to wonder, why did this other hand do this other thing when I didn't control it? Because it's controlled by the right hemisphere. You can put yourself in that point of view and I think imagine the conscious experience of the left hemisphere. I think you can do the same for the right hemisphere. I don't know how you can what we're supposed to imagine when you imagine both hemispheres are just you and your mind. You're somehow both hemispheres disconnected. I mean, is it like seeing um, with, are your visual fields overlapping? Are they superimposed? Um, and what would explain that? Because there's no neural connection at this point. So I just don't see what this could mean. I admit that it's a logical possibility. Um, I don't see any support for it. Any thoughts or questions before I go on? I mean, I once had a student just say, "Yeah, your whole mind is both." And this was not too long ago, maybe last semester. And I said, "So what do you mean?" And uh, he didn't go into detail. He just said, "I just think that it goes to both." And I, I mean, so what would it be like to be um, conscious in a way that depends on materially distinct entities that aren't in interaction with each other? Yasmin.
Hi, so when you were talking about the other example of like when one hemisphere goes offline, I guess even in the case of Jill Taylor, about Teller, that she like had this remembering of of being able to do certain things, right? So
Mhm.
if the two hemispheres are separated, but they both survive, is that what you're saying? So they're
In
both
this case, we're
like just
imagining,
okay.
yeah,
I mean, my first inclination is to say kind of where we've sort of what we've touched on would make me think, well, both hemispheres would retain some consciousness. I mean, and I don't have any way of of proving that other than just sort of maybe pointing to some of the examples.
yeah,
It just seems like maybe both would, but I don't know.
yeah, yeah. I mean, right now, this is just provoking thought, I think. But yes, we have the examples to rely on. We know that in split brain cases, they give every medical indication of consciousness. And we can get deeply skeptical and say, well, maybe they're just acting as if they're conscious when they're not. And philosophers are allowed to do that. But I think in medicine and science, we just we have to go with behavior and observations and tests, and we have every indication that they're both conscious, but I would say independently so. Jerome, go ahead.
So you're asking about if both halves are detached but still functioning. Isn't that similar to what was going on in the experiment that you showed us like a week or maybe 2 weeks ago, where they were
Yes.
looking, there was a patient who was, focused on the center point, and they were looking at things on both sides of the dot or whatever that focus point was. And yeah, due to whatever
Yeah.
condition she had, she was able to use one half of her brain, like both halves of her brain worked, but they were unable to communicate. Wasn't that the
Correct. That was this in the case of Joe, that was a split brain case.
yeah.
And yes, we're revisiting it now. This is a little bit more of a thought experiment because I'm asking in this case that there's no neural connection whatsoever. So in
Oh,
reality, the split brain um, does have some subcortical connections, so
yeah.
they're indirectly connected.
Okay.
Uh, but yeah, yeah, that's
So
the
in
idea.
that split brain, there was like, I don't remember the name of that part of the brain, but there was like that main bridge that we have.
The
Um,
corpus callosum.
yeah, the corpus callosum, and they're saying
Yeah,
that's what they cut and that's what they split in those situations, but they
that's
still have like
exactly.
connections. So
Yep, that's exactly right.
So
Yeah.
I guess if we were like to base it off of what we saw in that experiment, how they're able to still make certain connections, they're still able to draw certain things with the other hand. I guess in
Yeah.
that situation, like they just wouldn't be able to make that connection. Like let's say they look down at the paper and they may be able to write something with the other hand, but when they look at it, they wouldn't be able to make that connection and speak anymore. Like they'll be able to write it, but maybe they wouldn't be able to speak it. When they see it, like they wouldn't be able to recognize what they wrote and now formulate the words like he was in that video.
Yeah, good. So thanks, Jerome. I would encourage you to not use they because and try to be more specific. Like the right hemisphere would not be able to speak, but it would be able to draw with the left hand. The left hemisphere would be able to speak, but it would not be able to control the left hand. It would control the right hand. So try to be more precise with what exactly is it that's able to do one thing. But most people do what you just did. They talk about Joe. Joe can say what he saw on the right, but not on the left, and Joe
Yeah.
can draw it with his left hand, but not his right hand, etc. But I think we need to I think pronouns and names fail us in this case. I think we need to focus on the hemispheres, which is what Ramachandran and uh, others do. It's not my idea. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Okay. Uh, so so even in a, if you go back to the split brain case, um, the left hemisphere does not experience what the right hemisphere experiences, and vice versa. And so I don't see why we should embrace this third option given what we know about split brain patients. Because in this case, the hemispheres are even less connected, right? Uh, okay. So that leaves us with the fourth option, which is this whole single mind goes to neither. But then, are there any minds associated with these hemispheres at all? Again, I don't see why we should think that the single mind doesn't go anywhere. It just disappears for some reason. And and then finally, this is the more nuanced point. Um, Remember that Peter Godfrey Smith's view is that there's a single mind and it goes to the surviving hemisphere, and that hemisphere wasn't previously conscious, but now it is. Okay. Um, so when now there are two surviving hemispheres, either it goes left or not. And so imagine that when there's just one surviving hemisphere, it goes to the left. But what happens when there's two? The view seems to require a different answer, right? So I say, by what magic does the mere existence of a living right hemisphere change the status of the left? They're not connected. They're certainly not neurally connected, um, but they're not even physically connected. Only in the most um, tenuous of ways. You could say, well, there's heat transfer and across the gap in between them or something. Um, they both have mass, and so they exhibit some gravitational pull. But I mean, that is just the level of connection there is so negligible. And of course, they're more connected to plenty of other things. Uh, the moon exerts, more gravitational pull than a nearby other hemisphere. And there seems to be, I mean, I would ask, what's the causal mechanism that makes the difference, right? Because what Peter Godfrey Smith is saying is that the mind goes to the surviving hemisphere. And I'm saying, what happens when there isn't the surviving hemisphere? There's another hemisphere as well. What happens then? And it seems like in this case, he can say, well, the whole mind goes to the left. But in this case, it seemingly wouldn't. And so he seems to be asking, and this is why I think it's more counterintuitive than my view. He seems to be asking for a violation of causality. So for some kind of unscientific magical difference, right? When the right hemisphere does not exist, the left hemisphere is conscious. When the right hemisphere does exist, the left hemisphere isn't. Philosophers call this Cambridge change, and they call it that uh, to poke fun at it. Okay, so when I think Socrates' wife was named Xantippe. I've never known if I'm pronouncing it right, but I think it's Xantippe with an X pronounced as a Z. And when she dies, he becomes a widower. The moment she dies, he becomes a widower. So he does change in status, but he doesn't physically change, right? It's not like someone's looking at him and they go, "Oh, you just became a widower. I'm so sorry," right? I mean, maybe she's in the next room, maybe she's in another city, right? But the fact that she changes does, in a sense, change him. Similarly, when you look up at the stars at night and you pick out your favorite star to look at, it could be part of the Big Dipper, it could be the North Star, whatever, right? It could be on Orion's belt, one of those three stars. And you're looking at it, that star becomes looked at by you. Like it has the property of being looked at by you. It has the property of being appreciated by you, right? But of course, it doesn't physically change. And so it would be weird if whether a thing is conscious or not depends on the existence of other things that don't physically interact with it, don't physically cause it, right? It would make consciousness would be like being a widower or being looked at. And I just think obviously consciousness is not like that. There's, something that's like to be conscious. It makes a real difference in your life. And you can't imagine not being conscious, I would hold. But you can imagine losing consciousness in parts, losing your ability to hear sounds, losing your ability to see colors, but maybe still seeing in grayscale. Um, so you can imagine and most of us have experienced like the loss of consciousness when a limb falls asleep, or you might have had like an ocular migraine and lost a little bit of your field of vision. I've had one of those, etc. Okay. And so what I think he has inadvertently done is commit himself to a very unscientific view, which is that whether something is conscious or not depends on whether there's something else out there in the world doing whatever it does. Okay. So we're going to wrap this up and look at some neurophilosophical implications. Uh, so on this view that I think I've told you many times, I tried to avoid, thought was weird. Um, every functioning typical brain hosts many conscious minds at once. I put minds in scare quotes because I don't want this argument to be derailed by someone's particular notion of what it takes to be a mind. So what I really mean is just conscious experiencing entity, whatever exactly that is. If someone out there thinks, well, no, to be a mind, you have to have more than that. You have to have this, this, and this. Fine, but I think that's just um, a semantic distraction, right? Um, and so there are some conceptual accounts of mind that maybe the left hemisphere doesn't fulfill, or maybe the right hemisphere doesn't fulfill. But the point is, when I use mind in this presentation, I mean center of consciousness or conscious experiencing thing, something like that. If this is true, then consciousness is kind of a nebulous phenomenon. It's like heat, maybe, which holds in various ways of various overlapping things, depending on what exactly is individuated. So if you have a thing that has some heat, then the left half of it also has some heat. I'm not saying the same amount. Just if the whole thing has some heat, then the left half of it has some heat, and so does the right. And some properties are like this. Same goes for volume. Same goes for energy. And until you get down to a certain level, right? Same goes for mass. In fact, for this reason, among others, I've started long ago, started to think of consciousness, basic phenomenal consciousness, as a kind of fundamental property of things. So, what does this mean? Well, right now, you, scare quotes again, are reading this slide. However, at the very same time, parts of you are experiencing what it's like to be conjoined and interacting with other parts, which together compose the entity that is reading this slide. For example, the right hemisphere is, on this view, is having experiences that go along with reading the slide, and maybe having requiring a lot of interaction with the left hemisphere and assistance in going through that. And if your left hemisphere, were to shut down right now, the right hemisphere might have an experience like, wow, what just happened? I have no words. And so these, I'll highlight it. These are the parts that would survive, the parts that I'm referring to right now that are kind of going along with reading this slide. These are the parts which would survive as conscious experiencers of the loss of other parts, were those parts to die or become disconnected. For example, in a WADA test, anesthetized. So again, it's the right hemisphere. Were the left hemisphere to be anesthetized, the right hemisphere would suddenly have a very interesting experience. Okay, so that takes us to the end of my views on hemispherectomies in the WADA test. I'll go back to this slide, see if there are questions. Sometimes people want to know, why doesn't it seem like there's two me's or more, right? It seems like there's just no one in here but me, nobody else but me. That's one objection that I haven't addressed. Uh, I I've addressed this twice in print. So the optional paper, which is not primarily about this issue, it's about integrated information theory and neuroscientific theory of consciousness. In that paper, I revisit this idea and I address that objection. And briefly, it's this: we wouldn't get very far if the independently conscious regions of the brain were always in conflict with each other. They need to be they need to work in concert. They need to be harmonized, synchronized, um, and and so there's no reason to think that any independently conscious region, which is working in harmony with all the others, would think of itself as distinct. And by introspection, you wouldn't discover this. I mean, you would only when one of the regions shuts down and you think, "Oh my God, I have no words," or "I can't feel my left arm," or whatever. Only then would that region think of itself as distinct from the others, but not in normal life for most of us. Any questions? Araceli asks, could split brain explain dissociative personality disorders? I'm guessing not. So this is something people do ask. Uh, there's this old idea of a split personality, and there's some truth to it, but the popular conception of it is not something that's backed by science. But there are these dissociative disorders, and I don't I've never delved into it. I do know that the standard answer in among people who study the split brain is no, that's a entirely different kind of thing. Um, However, it's important to keep in mind that in split brain patients, there are similarities, right? One hemisphere can you say, what's your favorite color? And one hemisphere will point to one color and the other hemisphere will point to another. Uh, and that's not unusual. They will, presented with shirts in a closet, the two arms will grab two different shirts sometimes. I told you about the patient who smoked, and one hand would reach for the cigarettes and the other hand would knock them away. So you do get these conflicts sometimes. And before going to Jerome, I'll remind you of two anecdotes. So in the V.S. Ramachandran video, one patient claims to believe in God. I'm sorry, one hemisphere claims to believe in God and the other hemisphere claims not to. That's a pretty substantial difference. Uh, what else did I want to mention? Um, oh, right. In that video, he says that the patient who is a male, he means biologically male, when asked, "Are you a woman?" The right hemisphere says yes, and then the person laughs, and he says that proves that the right hemisphere has a sense of humor. I'm very surprised that he would say this because he should be well aware of the fact uh, that when the right hemisphere does something, the left hemisphere tries to interpret it. Okay. Um, and so they may not do this anymore, but back in like the 70s, uh, they would show a split brain patient, they'd show the right hemisphere an image from like a Playboy magazine. So it'd be a naked person, right? And the right hemisphere would see that, and the left hemisphere wouldn't. And and this would be unexpected. You'd get the kind of response that you'd expect. You'd get laughter or blushing or whoa, or something like that. Usually not language, but a kind of, are you seriously showing me a Playboy image uh, in an experiment, right? And so you get that kind of response, and like giggling, etc. And then the left hemisphere would having not seen that would interpret it. Why are you laughing? Oh, it's just funny to be doing this experiment. They would never say, oh, because I saw a naked person, an image of, pornographic image. Um, So he should be well aware of all this. The left hemisphere will try to interpret what the right hemisphere is doing. When you initiate motion, remember the right hemisphere controls mainly the left hand, but in the left hemisphere controls the right. But the right hemisphere has a little bit of control over the right. So when you tell the right hemisphere to, for example, touch or point at the coffee mug, the left hemisphere sees the arm reaching out toward the coffee mug and it thinks, well, I guess I'm grabbing the coffee mug. And so it will do the fine motor control. So you actually grab the handle of the mug and pick it up when the right hemisphere was just supposed to point at it. Okay, so those are all um, reasons to think of them as having their own personalities. And I see Emily has just written, I think that dissociative identity disorder is more caused by emotional trauma. Yes, it seems to be a different kind of thing, but yeah, that in at least in split brain cases, you get something similar. You get two entities, arguably, with different personalities. Jerome, go ahead. You've been very patient. Thank you.
Yeah, so you're talking about how like the different sides of the or the different hemispheres of your brain are the different hemispheres each have their own personality. I
Yeah.
guess I don't know. I was just thinking. I guess this would be an objective to this view, but I've always thought that like each side does have the potential to be conscious, but it kind of it goes where it thinks that it needs to go at that time, and if one gets removed, then obviously it'll be forced to be that that's the only thing that can be conscious. Kind of how we talked about neuroplasticity, how one part of your body may never do this certain function, but because of a certain scenario, if it's forced to, then it'll become stronger and it'll adapt and it'll suddenly be able to do that. So I know
Yeah.
that's kind of what I don't know. I guess for whatever reason, I don't know. I guess I just don't want to believe it. and that there's
Yeah.
no consciousness. So I'm always thinking about like, I don't know, just other, like I said, objections to it. And
Right.
yeah, I thought,
Well, it sounds like you're taking objection three. And that's what I did. And I admit I didn't want to believe it. And I delved into the literature on this. And again, there's nothing on the WADA test, very little on hemispherectomies. It's almost all split brain. But to the extent that people address this, and this is in the optional paper too, I have a list of philosophers, um, highly regarded, philosophers that have a whole career of work, some of them focusing on mind, and I have a list of them, and they all just, the moment they're presented with the possibility of multiple independently conscious entities, they just laugh it off and they just reject it without an argument. So I think we just have a very strong impulse to reject this idea because these are people that otherwise keep doing philosophy. But in this case, they're not doing philosophy. They're just saying, well, obviously that's not true.
I
And they
think
don't give any reason.
I,
They
I think
just
it's because it just doesn't feel that way, how you mentioned,
yeah.
we don't feel like different people, even if like you said, you mentioned how you show somebody the left side I don't remember exactly the scenario, but you were saying that the left side of the brain may say that it feels like a woman, and then the right side of the brain may say something different. Or the left
Yeah.
side, but I just know like I don't know, even if you feel like you may have slightly different responses in slightly different situations. I guess you still feel like it's always you, and you're only able to have like there's still certain things that you may never feel, and there's still certain things that you're always going to believe in, But I don't know. It
So
feels like even if
yeah,
if they are saying different things, that it's still I don't know. It still feels something that it still feels like they have something in common that they're sharing some type of
yeah,
trait that still feels
yeah,
like
absolutely. Yeah. So they have to work in harmony for us to do anything in life. And it's no surprise that they would be working in harmony because they're neurally connected. Um, now I can say a little bit more. So in the optional paper, I say, when you introspect and you think there's no one else in here but me, that doesn't rule out or exclude the possibility that there are a lot of independently conscious regions all thinking as a chorus. There's no one else in here but me. That's the way I put it. And um, uh, yeah, so So I tried to hold the objection three for a long period of time, and for the reasons we just went through, I realized that it requires some decidedly unscientific uh, uh, description. So that's why I can't say that my view is a knockdown argument. I just think it's the better interpretation. Thanks, Jerome. And yeah, I do think we have this the list of philosophers who just reject it out of hand without ever giving a reason suggests how strong this impulse is, or this bias, or whatever you want to call it. Bobby says, I feel whenever I focus on something, I just have the instinct to grab it, even though I don't need it. Like my brain is programmed to take action whenever it's needed, if that makes sense. That's interesting. Um, I don't know if I mean, I think it might depend on how I'm focusing on it or what I'm focusing on, but that's interesting. Araceli says, what if it's a defense mechanism to reject it? It might be. I mean, some people are unnerved by this because they think it means, well, there's real me and then there's others in my head, but I'm not saying that. I'm saying that they're just different regions that are independently conscious. I don't even know if it makes sense anymore to talk about real me. I'm not the first person to say that either. Uh, Somewhat reminds me of the family systems theory. Uh, and if you want to say more about that, Krizia, go ahead, please. I'll pause for a moment.
Yeah, so family systems theory is a theory in psychology where we're pretty much made up of parts where they interact with each other, and these are like theoretical parts, and they're all usually based in like trauma or ways that our emotional self relates to itself. And
Uh-huh.
so I'm thinking of like how our brain could possibly also have those parts, like the physiological side of it can also have its own sort of like consciousness and role.
Yeah. Nice, nice. I don't know that much about family systems theory, but I just sent you a reply that says you might want to see Daniel Dennett's multiple drafts theory, which I'm I realized after publication that I absolutely should have included, at least in a footnote, some mention of his multiple drafts theory, because he makes a similar point, but he's not really focusing on consciousness and it's different in a lot of ways, but I should have credited him. And that sounds like it might dovetail with what you're bringing up. Grace says, could split brain theory potentially explain addictive behavior? I don't know. I don't yet know what you have in mind. If you want to elaborate, go ahead. Um, I did mention that, the smoking case, so the one hemisphere wants to smoke and the other one doesn't.
Yeah, I guess just like it just reminded me of addictive behavior because it's like sort of, it's like compulsively engaging in the same kind of behavior despite it having such harmful consequences and like being aware of that, but also, continuing to do so and how that can kind of like just sort of just reminded me of like the concept of like feeling like there's two different minds inside of you or something.
Yeah. Yeah, I see. So the addiction is interesting uh, because you seem to have two goals. And so take tobacco. One is to smoke a cigarette, and one is to quit. Like at some higher level, almost all smokers realize it'd be better if they quit. Um, and yet there's another part of you that wants to keep smoking, and then some of us wrestle with that sometimes over years, throughout entire lives. So yeah, I think um, it's at least similar, and it could be that one hemisphere is addicted and the other one isn't. It could be that one hemisphere is demanding the hit of tobacco or whatever. I never tied up that point about the left hemisphere laughing when the right hemisphere said, I'm a woman. Um, yeah, the whole point is that it could be that the right hemisphere was answering sincerely, that the right hemisphere identifies as a woman, and the left hemisphere is laughing, thinking, "Well, I don't," and so it's funny that I would say that. The left hemisphere could just be laughing it off or laughing nervously or whatever. Um, and the psychologist Ian McGilchrist comes very close to a view like this. He has a book where he argues that we're used to calling the left language producing hemisphere the dominant hemisphere, but it's really the right hemisphere that controls the show. And the left hemisphere is always playing catch up and trying to interpret what the right hemisphere is doing. Yeah. What if Darla says, what if 11 body systems, reproductive, endocrine, et cetera, all have independent minds? Interesting. It it could be that so in addition to the left and right hemispheres, there are these other regions that are um, they're kind of easy to demarcate from other regions. Now, of course, it's a giant tangle of neurons, and so they're connected, and and some to some extent drawing borders around regions is arbitrary, but some systems just seem to be much more self-contained than others. And so I'd be interested in that. And that's something I've never really gotten into. Like the the part of the brain that controls the endocrine system, is it localized? And to what extent is it localized, et cetera? And if it was localized, then yes, I'd wonder. We can also ask about the cerebellum, which is at the base, it's underneath the cortex. And has a lot to do with motor control. And it's neurologically not like the rest of the brain, or at least it's not like the cortex, in that the neurons don't interact as much. There's not as much interconnection between them. So the processing is for any stream of neurons is largely independent of the processing of others. Um, and some people think that gives you reason to think that that's probably not conscious. Madeline asks, which hemisphere is in control while sleepwalking? I'm not sure that one is. It might be that both are, to the extent that there's much control. Yeah. These are interesting questions. Lucas, go ahead, please.
I was just wondering, like, if the split brain stuff could relate to like dualism in, I think you already said that earlier, of just like how how does the evidence of our hemispheres having distinct personalities, how does that like create more evidence towards consciousness being like actual, like having more evidence for it to be real?
Good. Did you see the Ramachandran video where he asks a split brain patient? We watched it in class, but maybe you missed it. Uh, he asks a patient, "Do you believe in God?"
Yeah, I think I saw that.
Yeah, I think so. So how he interprets that, he says this should have caused a tsunami in the theological community. In other words, people who believe in souls should be really surprised by this because what's going on? Are there two souls now? Is one a believer on its way to heaven and the other one a disbeliever going to hell? And of course, you don't have to take that seriously, even if you believe in souls. You don't have to believe that they must be going to one of two afterlives. But uh, yeah, he thinks if you're a dualist, then this should raise some flags, some red flags, and I think that's partly that's why I include Richard Swinburne's point, because here you see an example of a dualist who resists that. He says it's not clear that you have to have two souls, or even if you have one soul, that it would be able to interact with both. But it does raise really interesting questions. Um, Madeline followed up. I find it similar because when you wake up, you don't remember what you did. Similarly, oh, this is good. Okay, I have something to share. Similarly to how the left hemisphere doesn't know what the right hemisphere does, but we tend to hold the belief that when one sleepwalks, they aren't a different person. Right. So you wake up from sleepwalking. You are in some cases you do some intentional things. You don't just walk. You might open the refrigerator or whatever. You turn doorknobs, open doors. Uh, might even maybe get into a car. Uh, Now notice this, people. Uh, we can surprise ourselves in dreams. So you're asleep, just normal. You're not sleepwalking. You're just asleep, having a dream, and something surprising can happen. Where'd that come from? Well, presumably it came from some region of your brain. So we might all have experiences that are like the experience of, say, a split brain patient who looks down and, why'd you draw a saw? I don't know, right? I'm surprising myself because I'm just producing the saw with my hand. Or Sarah Scott, where she doesn't know how to say something, so she writes it. Some region of her brain can write it for her, some other region can read it and then say, you know, whatever the word was. I think it was aphasia. Yeah, she says aphasia with the question mark. Um, or Joe says, the left hemisphere says a saw with a question mark again. Uh, and so I think we all do this. We experience this when we dream. As a physicist pointed out to me long ago when I was at a kind of a neuroscience conference, we were discussing that you can be surprised by your own dreams, and this suggests that there's not just one conscious entity. Araceli says there was a guy who claimed he was sleepwalking when he got into a car and murdered someone. Yikes. Right. I can see that being a defense. But is the part of your brain that surprises you with a dream a different consciousness? Yeah, it might not be conscious. That's true. But it's certainly an interesting part um, because it's producing often coherent, um, you know, experiences. Yeah. But yes, we don't have the fact that you can be surprised by your dream doesn't entail or even strongly suggest that there must be some other conscious experience. So it's good to point out, Madeline. So why is the other hemisphere a different consciousness? Well, for the reasons I've been giving. Um, so we have good reason from split brain cases that they have different conscious experiences. I mean, if one believes in God and the other one doesn't, if one has the favorite color of blue and the other one says favorite color is red, etc. That's good reason to think that they're different consciousness. And then to add to it, the hemispherectomy. So imagine the left hemisphere of a split brain patient dies, uh, the right hemisphere continues. I would say that one conscious experience has ceased to exist and another one has not. Madeline, go ahead.
Sorry, I feel like I have to start talking instead of typing.
Yeah.
I guess I have like a weird like parallel between these two, the idea of like dreaming and the idea of like a different consciousness with hemispheres. Because I mean, I've had crazy dreams. I'm assuming everybody here has had dreams that they don't agree with or like nightmares. And so if one person, one quote, consciousness loves their partner, right? And then the quote consciousness that's dreaming cheats on their partner, is that to me that kind of seems to be the same logic as like, well, one hemisphere says they believe in God and the other one says they don't. Am I missing something, or is that the same logic?
You're not missing something. I think in the case of the hemispheres, we know that mechanically the right hemisphere is doing the pointing with the left hand, and mechanically the left hemisphere is using the right hand. We know that. In the case of dreaming, we don't know that one hemisphere is loving the partner and the other hemisphere is dreaming about cheating on the partner. What we know is that the, somehow or other there's loving the partner and there's having a dream about cheating on the partner, but we don't know where that occurs. So that's the one. But it could be that one hemisphere is inclined to fantasize about adultery and the other one isn't.
Does
I
it?
mean, yeah.
Sorry, continue.
Well, I would say it seems to be testable. It seems like you could get split brain patients and ask them questions about adultery and see if you get differences.
Would it matter if it's like half of the brain? Like let's say, the part that's dreaming. There's a lot of, ideas and theories about where our dreams come from and which part of the brain and all that. So does it matter if it's half of the brain that's doing it or if it's less than half of the brain? It seems like because we think that like a scattered area of the brain creates dreams and then exact half of the brain creates the different actions in split brain patients. It seems like we don't um, give credit, I guess, to the scattered part because it's not like in unison. But I'm pretty sure I'm not a brain scientist, obviously, but I'm pretty sure there's like when you make a decision or when you decide to do something, there's a completely not random, but seems random. It's not like this exact section lights up. It's like this section and this section.
Oh
And it's
yeah,
not really like half of the brain lights up. It's just kind of scattered.
good. You're saying, I think you're saying when you make a decision, it's a largely holistic phenomenon. It's not just one part of the brain that makes the decision. So decision making isn't localized to some region. It's more holistic. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I guess I'm
Yeah.
I'm trying to relate it to this idea that because the brain is exactly split down the middle, and this side is making a decision, the other side is making a decision, we tend to think that, or in this theory, we think that those must be two different consciousnesses. But when we make a decision and three areas of our brain light up, we don't think that those three areas of our brain is a different conscious. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think it does. And I think you're right that we tend to think that way. And what I would say is, let's say when you make a decision, three areas of the brain light up. I would say that if any one of those areas could survive the loss of the others and have a conscious experience as a result, I would say that it is independently conscious.
So for the case of I do not remember this guy's name, but there's a famous case in psychology where a man was impaled through the head with a bar. And
Yeah,
he
Phineas Gage.
There we go, Phineas Cage, thank you.
Yeah,
And he survived the loss of certain sections of his brain. His
yes.
personality changed. So would you say that the I don't know which parts of his brain was lost with the metal rod shooting through his brain, but would you say that because those maybe two or three parts of the brain were lost and he still gained consciousness and he changed his consciousness, would you say that therefore those parts are independent, are
Yeah.
different consciousnesses? Then does that mean every single part of the brain is a different conscious?
No, not necessarily. Yeah, it's such a good question. So yeah, with Phineas Gage, an explosion sent a metal bar or rod through his, I think it was right temporal lobe, but I'm not sure. I mean, frontal lobe is what I said. Should have said. Yes, he survived. He continued to be conscious, but he did behave differently. And I'm saying that, uh, yeah, prefrontal cortex, that if the result was the remaining portions of the brain thinking, well, this is different, right? I used to be this and now I'm that. Then that's something that was independently conscious prior to it, to the event. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. And but it's true that a lot of what we do cognitively, we know is holistic and distributed throughout the brain. And that might be the case for dreams as well. I've never studied dreams in any kind of neuroscientific way. So I just don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if when you're dreaming, there's a lot of distributed activity. In fact, I'm sure of it. I would bet money that there is. I just haven't studied it. So possibly I'm wrong about that. Yeah.
Could I ask one more question? I'm sorry, I'm taking up
Please.
so much time.
No, it's okay. Go.
Um, with that in mind, like the way that you said that because he lost, two or three parts, it's a different conscious. What is stopping I'm assuming you have the opinion that not every single piece of the brain is a different conscious. What is
And the
stopping
reason,
that?
yeah, the reason why is I think that if you lost almost all of your brain and there's just this little cluster of neurons that survived, I'm not going to argue that that is necessarily a conscious entity that's thinking, "Whoa, what just happened? Who turned out the lights?" Um, so there are parts that they might survive biologically. They might still be living cells, but I'm not sure that they give rise to consciousness independently.
Oh gosh, I have one more question.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, in the case of someone with traumatic brain injury or a severely disabled person where parts of the brain simply do not exist,
Yeah.
um, is that person conscious?
Frankly, we debate these things. We don't know for sure. Um, in some cases, I think it's clear that the person is conscious. In some cases, it's unclear. And in some cases, it's almost universally agreed that the patient is what they might call brain dead, unconscious. But they do debate these things. And there was a recent case in the Bay Area of a patient. I mean, it's about 10 years old at this point or more, maybe, um, who neurologists declared to be brain dead and not conscious. The family disagreed. They did not want this girl to be taken off life support.
Hmm.
And so we still debate these things. We don't know.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What would these the two opposing beliefs that we're talking about right now, what would they say about the 11-year-old girl?
Uh, well, I don't remember exactly how old she was when she went unconscious or went into this state that is debated. Um, I I remember she was prepubescent because because as time went on, she entered puberty, and that was used as evidence in favor of the idea that she might still be conscious. Um, I can get her name, I think, very quickly. I think because maybe not. I think I might have closed that tab unless it's right here. Oh yeah. Okay, so this patient's name is Jahi McMath. I'll put that in the. She was 13, and I'm going to put that in the chat. And the reason I had this tab open is because on this view, the brainstem itself can be conscious. Those who argue that Jahi McMath was still conscious. She died, not because she was taken off life support, but she ended up never regaining typical consciousness and did pass away some time ago. Checking the time. Okay, now we're about to move into the next section, but I did also want to share with you the fact that there are craniopagus twins. Craniopagus means joined by the cranium. So they're twins who are joined at the cranium, and they seem to, there we go. Uh, they seem to be able to communicate neurally. So some of their doctors say that although they have their own brains, each one has a thalamus, and the thalamus is joined by what they call a thalamic bridge. We don't have time to watch this, but I'll jump ahead and we'll watch this one part. We don't have time to watch the whole thing, but I'll make it available.
called a thalamic bridge. The thalamic bridge is like a high-speed optic fibre, and in their case, it appears to be a two-way highway. Thoughts, feelings, ideas can cross this bridge and into the other brain. They still...
To contextualize it, there are a lot of people who are skeptical of this, but there is some evidence that shows that at least sensory data crosses this on this tissue. That one twin can know when the other twin has seen something. There's some evidence, but I'm concerned that there are some people who are eager to embellish this in a lot of ways without evidence.
Have functioning full brains on each side, connected by this robust thalamic bridge that allows information of all manner to cross.
So they're plugged in, essentially.
It's like you've got two independent television sets, okay? But there's a cable that's running between the two of them. And even though you can watch channel 2 over here and you can watch channel 4 over here, every once in a while, this one can turn on the station that this one is watching and tune into it.
That looks really tasty. That's a good-looking cheese sandwich.
When they tune in, how they do, why they tune into each other, are some of the myriad of light her eyes being covered.
This is where I should have started.
Krista can still see the pig.
Krista, what's Mommy holding?
A piggy.
That's right, Mommy's holding the piggy.
Goodness me.
So that is the claim, that via the thalamic bridge, what one twin senses, that some of that is transmitted over to the other one, and the other twin can report what is being seen. Now they did do some imaging where they'd flash light in the eyes of one twin and they'd get neural activation, the appropriate kind, in the brain of the other twin. And that at least has been established. They count that as some evidence that one twin can respond to what the other twin sees. This claim that the twins can share thoughts and all that, it's anecdotally supported. The family believes it, and they think it's obvious and demonstrated, but I'm not aware of it being clinically tested. And everyone who tests these things and studies and does this, they know how, even when we're not trying to deceive anyone, we're not trying to make things up, we can sometimes, convince ourselves that we're seeing and observing things that we're really just confabulating or imagining. Okay, so we'll pick it up here, and the next thing we're doing is looking at the McCulloch-Pitts neuron. We're going to get more into the neurology of neurons and how it is that these things that just arise in nature, right? Neurons, how does it they might represent things in the world? Because it seems like nothing else in the universe represents other things, like is about other things. But it seems like neurons and collections of them, when they're active, seem like they're about things. I look at the tree outside my window or the cat on the lawn, and there are neural events that supposedly are about those things. So that's where we're headed. Okay. Thanks, everyone. That's all for today. And I just want to add, Madeline, I appreciate that kind of questioning. And I look forward to other students doing it as well. This is a very much a discussion type class, as I think philosophy always should be. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
All right.
Professor. Have a good one.
Yeah, you too. Take care. Okay. Ending the recording.